The snow comes early this year, same as it did that other winter, the one I still measure every hard season against. I hear the wagon before I see it, the creak of wheels over the frozen ruts, the stamp of the mule outside the arched wooden door, and I know my grandchild has come up from town at last, cheeks red as a winter apple, stomping the cold-off boots that are far too thin for this mountain. "Grandmother," she says, ducking through the doorway my husband built with his own 2 hands, nearly 30 years gone. "They're saying in town that our house is the oldest standing place on the ridge, older than the church, older than the mill." I laugh and pull my shawl tighter, settling into the chair by the hearth. The same stones, the same warmth that has never once failed us, not in all these years. "Older than most things around here," I tell her, "except your grandfather's stubbornness, and that goes back further than the house does." She sits at my feet the way she did when she was small, and the firelight catches the curve of the timber beams overhead, dark and smooth with age, curved like the ribs of some great sheltering animal. She has heard pieces of the story before. Everyone in Granite Ridge has heard pieces of it. But tonight, the wind is picking up outside, rattling against stone that does not rattle back, and she wants the whole of it, start to finish, the way only an old woman sitting by her own fire can tell it. "Tell me how you built it," she says. "Tell me why you built it into the mountain instead of a proper cabin like everybody else." Proper cabin, I smile at that. There was a time those very words were flung at us like stones, back when folks in the valley thought 2 young fools with more hope than sense had lost their minds entirely. "It wasn't because we wanted to be strange," I tell her, watching the fire settle. "It was because we didn't have a choice, and your grandfather had a gift for turning no choice into something better." I close my eyes for a moment, and the years fall away like snow, sliding off a steep roof. I can feel the chill of that first autumn morning, the wagon wheels sinking into soft dirt outside a town called Granite Ridge, the mountains rising up gray and endless around 2 people who owned little more than a few tools, a handful of seed, and each other. "It was the year 1888, I say softly, "and we arrived here in the early autumn, with no money to speak of, and not near enough lumber to build the kind of house folks expected a young married couple to build." My grandchild leans closer, the fire popping between us, and outside the wind begins its old familiar howl against stone walls that have never once let it in. "Tell me everything," she whispers. So I do. That first morning, the wagon creaked to a stop at the edge of a meadow gone gold with frost, and he set the brake before he even looked at me. I remember thinking how tired his face was, how the mountains behind him seemed to swallow the little wagon whole. We had crossed half of Colorado to reach that valley, trading nearly everything we owned along the way for flour, salt pork, and a mule that turned out to be more stubborn than useful. What remained fit into a single trunk, some nails, a handsaw, a hatchet, and a Bible that had been his mother's. He climbed down first, boots sinking into soft earth still damp from an early rain, and turned to help me down beside him. Neither of us said a word for a long moment. We simply stood there, staring at the town below, a scatter of rough buildings, smoke rising thin from a few chimneys, and at the endless slope of pine and granite rising above it. "We'll need lumber," he said finally, more to himself than to me, and I heard the worry folded into those 4 words. We rode into Granite Ridge that same afternoon, hopeful the mill might extend us credit against the promise of a good harvest come next year. The mill owner, a broad man with kind eyes and no patience for foolishness, looked at our few coins and shook his head slow. "Enough for a door frame, maybe," he said. "Not enough for 4 walls and a roof before the snow comes." He wasn't unkind about it, just honest, in the way frontier men often were when there was no room left for anything but the truth. I watched my husband's shoulders tighten, though he thanked the man politely and led me back outside. We sat on the wagon seat a long while, the mule chewing at some weeds by the road, while he stared up at the mountains as though they might offer an answer neither of us could find in town. "We could build small," I offered. "A soddy, maybe, like some of the others." "A soddy won't hold through a mountain winter," he said. "Not up this high." He rubbed a hand along his jaw, thinking the way he always did before deciding something important. Slow, careful, turning the problem over like a stone in his palm. "We need walls that don't care how cold it gets." I didn't understand what he meant then, only that his eyes had drifted toward the rocky rise above the meadow, where gray stone broke through the earth like the bones of the mountain itself. He was quiet a long time, watching that hillside as the autumn light shifted gold across the peaks. "Emily," he said at last, "I think I know where we ought to build." The fire has burned low now, and my grandchild leans forward to add another log, the way children do when they want a story to keep going a little longer. I let the flames catch before I continue, because some memories need light to be told right. We left the wagon at the meadow's edge that afternoon and walked up through knee-high grass gone brittle with frost, his hand steady under my elbow, though the ground was uneven and my skirts kept catching on scrub. He didn't say much, only pointed now and again at outcroppings of stone, testing them with his boot, running his palm along seams in the rock as though he were reading a letter written in a language only he understood. Then we came around the shoulder of the hill, and there it was. A hollow, wide and deep, carved into the mountainside by some patient hand of water or ice long before either of us was born. The back wall rose in a curve of solid granite, and the opening faced south, toward the valley, toward the sun. I remember standing very still, the wind pulling at my bonnet, while he walked the length of it with his arms spread as though measuring a room already built. "Here," he said, "we build here." I laughed, though not unkindly, more from the surprise of it. "Into the mountain? Like some den for a bear?" "Like a house that doesn't fight the winter," he said, "but leans into it instead." He explained it as we stood there, the way he always explained things, patient and unhurried, building the idea board by board in the air between us. Stone walls we wouldn't have to haul far, since the hill itself would give us most of what we needed. The earth, packed thick around us for warmth, colder ground never freezing so deep as the wind above it, a door strong enough to hold against anything the mountain could throw. I listened, and though my stomach turned over at the strangeness of it, I found myself nodding, slow at first, then steadier. "It won't look like the neighbors' cabins," I said. "No," he agreed, "it won't. They'll talk. Let them talk." He turned to me then, his face earnest in that way that always undid my worry before it could take root. "I'd rather have 4 cold months of gossip than 1 collapsed roof come January." I thought of the man in town, his voice flat with warning, and I thought of the mule waiting patient below, and I thought of the long stretch of winter still ahead of us, with no walls yet standing between us and it. But looking at that hollow in the rock, I felt something settle in me. Not certainty exactly, but trust. Trust in him, in his slow, careful thinking, in the years we'd already promised each other before God and family. "Then let's build it," I said, and he smiled the way he did when he already knew I would. We shook hands on it right there, foolish as that sounds for husband and wife, and started back down the hill to fetch our tools before the light failed us. The fire popped just then, and I looked up to find my grandchild still watching me, waiting, the way children do when they sense the good part is coming. "Did the neighbors really laugh?" they asked. I told them yes, laughed, and worse than laughed. Word travels fast in a mountain settlement, faster than snow melts in April. Within a week, half of Granite Ridge knew what we meant to build. The blacksmith's wife called it a badger's den. The man from town, the one with the flat warning voice, rode up special to see it with his own eyes, shook his head, and told my husband straight out that no roof cut into a hillside could bear a Colorado snowpack. "Rock shifts," he said. "Earth settles. You'll wake up buried, or you won't wake up at all." I remember how my husband only nodded, polite as Sunday, and kept measuring the hollow with a length of rope. We didn't argue with them. What was there to say that the work itself wouldn't answer better? So we hauled stone. God, how we hauled stone. From the creek bed, from tumbled outcrops higher on the slope, dragging it down on a sledge my husband built from scrap boards, stone by stone until my hands ached in a way I'd never known hands could ache. He shaped the beams himself, choosing timber with a natural curve to it, steaming the stubborn ones over a fire pit until they'd bend to the arch we needed. I'd never seen a man work like that, patient as winter itself, never rushing, never cursing the wood when it fought him. The neighbors kept riding past, slow on their horses, watching us like we were a curiosity at a county fair. Some called out fool notions dressed up as friendly advice. Others just watched, silent, which somehow felt worse. I won't pretend it didn't sting. There were nights I lay awake in our tent, listening to the wind and wondering if we were building a home or a grave, same as the man in town predicted. But then my husband would wake before dawn, already reaching for the mallet, already whistling some tune from before we married, and I'd remember why I'd said yes to this whole wild plan in the first place. He believed in it. And more than that, he believed in us, in what two stubborn young people could raise out of rock and timber and sheer refusal to quit. By the second week we'd set the first course of stone into the hillside, thick as a man's forearm, packed tight with earth behind it. It didn't look like anything yet, just walls half swallowed by the hill, an opening where a door might someday hang. But standing there in the cold October light, sweat freezing on my collar, I felt something shift in me. Pride, maybe, or the first thin thread of the certainty I hadn't found on that first evening. Whatever it was, it carried us forward into the harder work still waiting. I still keep the fire built the way he taught me that autumn. Slow, patient, never rushing the kindling. My grandchild doesn't know that yet, sitting there with cocoa cooling in her hands, waiting for me to go on. So I do. After the walls rose, we turned to the inside of the hill itself. My husband had this notion, half genius and half madness, that we ought to dig rooms straight into the earth behind the stone, not just for sleeping, but for keeping things. Potatoes, cured meat. Jars of anything I could preserve before the frost took the garden. We worked with shovels and our bare hands some days, hauling out rock and clay until our backs screamed and our palms split. But the deeper we dug, the more I understood what he was after. The earth back there never froze, not really. It stayed cool and steady, like the mountain was holding its breath just for us. By the time we finished the second storeroom, my hands were rougher than any woman's I'd known back home, and I found I didn't mind it one bit. The door came next, and that was its own kind of battle. My husband wanted it big, arched, heavy, built to shoulder against wind that could peel bark off a tree. He spent 3 days shaping the curve of it alone, steaming the wood over a fire pit until it bent to his will, cursing under his breath when it sprang back the wrong way. I held the frame steady while he fit the hinges, my arms trembling, snow already starting to fall soft and quiet around us, like the sky itself was watching to see if we'd finish in time. We did, barely. The first real storm rolled down off the peaks 2 days later, gray and low and moving fast, the kind of sky that makes even brave men go quiet. We latched that big door just as the wind hit, and I remember bracing myself, half expecting the whole hillside to groan and give way like the old-timer in town had warned us it would. Instead, nothing. No creak, no shudder, just the muffled roar of wind outside, distant as a memory. I lit a lantern and looked around at the strange little room we'd carved out of stone and dirt, and for the first time since we'd left the wagon behind, I felt truly warm. Not just from the fire, warm in a deeper way, down in my chest, the kind of warm that comes from knowing you've done something right even when the whole world told you otherwise. My husband caught my eye across the room, snow still melting off his shoulders, and he grinned like a boy who'd won a bet nobody else believed he could. "Dry," he said, like it was the finest word in the English language. It was, and outside the storm was only just beginning. My grandchild leaned forward then, the fire catching the eagerness in those young eyes, and asked, "But that wasn't the worst of it, was it, grandmother? What happened next?" I set down my knitting and looked into the flames a long moment, the way you do when you're deciding how much of the truth a young heart can carry. "No," I said. "That storm was only the first knock at the door. What came after? Well, child, nobody in that valley had seen a winter like it, not before and not since." I told her how the snow that fell in those first weeks of November wasn't ordinary snow at all. It came sideways, driven by winds that screamed down off the peaks like something alive and angry, burying the fence posts clear to their tops within a fortnight. My husband would go out mornings with a shovel just to find the barn door, and some days the wind changed the shape of the world entirely overnight, so that a path he'd cleared the evening before was simply gone by dawn, as though it had never existed. "We didn't know it then," I told her, "but that winter would be remembered for 50 years after. The winter that broke the mountain road clean in 2 places and left half the valley cut off from Granite Ridge entirely. Wagons couldn't get through. The mail stopped coming. Men who'd laughed at our strange round house found themselves trapped behind drifts taller than their own roofs, burning furniture to keep from freezing, rationing flour by the spoonful. "Were you frightened?" she asked, and I could hear in her voice that she already knew what I would say, because grandchildren always know their grandmothers better than they let on. "Terribly," I admitted. "But fear is a strange companion out there in the wild places. It either paralyzes you or it sharpens you, and thank the Lord, ours sharpened us." I told her how my husband and I would lie awake some nights listening to the wind try the door, testing it like a wolf testing a gate, and how each morning we woke grateful simply to still be warm, still be dry, when we knew others weren't. "We began keeping a tally," I said, marking each day the storms held, scratching lines into a beam by the hearth. "That very beam there, child, the one your grandfather cut with his own 2 hands. I pointed to it, dark with age now, worn smooth by decades of hands resting against it, just as mine did that winter. By the 4th week," I said, my voice softening, "we started hearing rumors carried by the rare traveler who managed the road, rumors of homesteads running low on wood, families with children going hungry, livestock lost in drifts." I paused, watching the fire settle into embers. That was when we understood our strange little house wasn't only going to keep us alive that winter. My grandchild's eyes widened. It was going to save other people too. How did you know for certain? My grandchild asked, and I set another log against the andirons before answering, for some things deserve the weight of fire between the words. Because the road simply vanished, I said, not covered, vanished, as though the mountain had swallowed it whole. The storms that winter did not come one at a time, politely, the way storms are supposed to. They came in waves, each one arriving before the last had finished settling, piling higher against the hollow's rim until the drifts stood taller than a man on horseback. My husband tried twice to walk toward the valley, roped at the waist the way sailors lash themselves to a mast, and both times he came back with his beard frozen white and his voice grim. "Fences are gone," he told me the second time, stamping snow from his boots. "Not broken, buried. You'd not know a fence was ever there." Somewhere below us, families we had shared church suppers with, families whose children we had watched grow taller each season, were running low on split wood, their sheds emptied faster than they'd planned, their woodpiles never meant to outlast such fury. We heard it in fragments, a trapper passing through half-frozen, a rancher's boy who nearly didn't make it up our slope, his hands so numb he couldn't lift the ladle I offered him. And yet inside our hollow, the fire barely needed feeding. That was the strange mercy of it. The earth around us held its warmth like a patient friend, releasing it slow and steady no matter how the wind screamed outside our arched door. I would press my palm against the stone wall some mornings, marveling that it was never truly cold, only cool, like a cellar in July. Our storeroom, dug deep into the hillside, kept our potatoes firm, our salted meat sound, our jars of preserves untouched by frost or rot. While others watched their provisions dwindle and spoil, ours simply waited, patient as the mountain itself. We didn't feel lucky, exactly, I told my grandchild, choosing the word carefully. We felt afraid for them, truly afraid. My husband began walking the fence line each day it was possible, not to check our own boundaries but to listen, for smoke that wasn't rising where it should, for silence where there ought to be sound. He'd come back and report what he could piece together, and each report weighed heavier than the last. Livestock lost, a young family with 3 children rationing flour by the spoonful, an old widower alone on the ridge with no way down and no way for help to reach up. I remember looking at our own shelves, still full, still ours by grace and hard labor both, and feeling something shift inside me. Not guilt, but purpose. "We have more than we need," I said to him one evening, and he looked at me the way he always did when he already knew what I was about to propose, before I'd even finished thinking it myself. My grandchild leaned closer to the fire then, the way children do when they sense a story is about to turn somewhere new, and I let myself settle back into that winter, into the particular cold of it, before I told what came next. It was the water that saved us first, before we ever thought of saving anyone else. I ought to explain that, because without it, none of the rest could have happened the way it did. We had noticed it that first autumn, a faint trickle sound behind the deepest storage room we dug into the hillside, barely more than a whisper beneath the stone. My husband thought it might be nothing, some trick of wind finding a crack, but he went at it with a shovel one October afternoon anyway, curious the way he always was about the mountain's secrets. What he found was a spring, small and steady, running clear beneath the earth at the back of our hollow, cold as anything but never frozen, not even in the deepest part of January, when the creek down in the valley had gone to solid ice thick enough to walk across. We hadn't understood then what a gift that was. Not truly. Not until the storms came and stayed, and we watched from our doorway as neighbors trudged past with buckets, breaking through crusted snow to melt it pot by pot over precious fuel, wasting wood just to have something to drink. My husband would stand there some mornings, watching that particular struggle, and I'd see his jaw tighten in the way it did when a thing troubled him deep. "They're burning wood for water," he said to me once, like it pained him personally. "Wood they'll need for warmth before this is through." We had no such trouble. Our spring ran on, indifferent to the storm above, filling our buckets clean and cold whenever we needed, costing us nothing but the walk to fetch it. It was a strange kind of wealth, water that didn't demand payment in firewood or daylight, or strength already spent thin. I remember filling a jar of it just to hold, turning it in the lamplight, thinking how odd it was that something so quiet could matter so much. That was the evening I said what I said to him, about having more than we needed. The water was part of it, though not all. We had food that wasn't spoiling, warmth that wasn't failing, and now I understood we had something else too, a kind of steadiness the mountain itself seemed to be offering us, as though it approved of the labor we'd put into it. My husband didn't answer right away. He set another log on the fire, watched the flame catch, and finally said, "Then we'd best not keep it only for ourselves." I didn't know yet what that would mean. Not fully, not the shape it would take once the next knock came at our door. But I knew, watching him, that we had already decided. The next knock came before I'd even washed the jar. A man from the Whitfield place, half frozen, leading a mule that could barely stand, his own homestead 3 miles down, buried past the fence line. My husband didn't ask what he wanted. He just opened the door wider and said, "Get that animal in before it drops." That was the beginning of it, though we didn't call it anything then. Just a man and a mule needing shelter for a night that stretched into 3. I think about that often, sitting here now with the fire low and you beside me. How quickly a house can change shape around the people who need it. We hadn't built for company. We'd built for survival, for the two of us, and whatever the mountain threw down on our heads. But a house built strong enough to hold back a mountain, it turns out, is also strong enough to hold more than you planned for. My husband set to work almost before the man had thawed. He took timber we'd saved for other purposes and built a lean stable against the hillside, right beside our arched door, close enough that a man wouldn't freeze walking from one to the other. He packed the roof with the same earth and brush we'd used on our own, said if it worked once it would work twice. It did. That stable held horses and mules and one stubborn old goat through the rest of that winter, and never once did the wind get past the walls he raised. Inside, I found my own work waiting. The stone interior, the one folks had laughed at for being cold and strange, I turned part of it into a kitchen proper. Moved the flour barrel close to the hearthstone, built a shelf for the bread pans, and began baking every morning like the house itself demanded it. Word travels strange on a mountain in winter, slower than gossip in town, but surer, passed hand to hand between men clearing drifts. Somehow everyone who lost their way, everyone whose fire had gone to embers and stayed there, found themselves pointed toward our door. I baked bread until my arms ached and didn't care. There's a particular joy, dear, in watching someone half dead with cold take their first bite of something warm and watch the life come back into their face. I understood then what my husband meant about not keeping it only for ourselves. It wasn't charity, not really. It was just what the house wanted to be used for. By the second week, We'd fed 11 different souls, sheltered 6 animals, and still had grain enough in that hillside storeroom to last another month. Neighbors who'd once stood at a distance shaking their heads now stood at our door with their hats in their hands, grateful and a little bewildered, as though the mountain had played a trick on all of them, and only 2 people had known the punchline all along. The fire's burned low again, hasn't it? Let me stir it before I go on. Some parts of this story need the warmth to tell right. There was a man who'd laughed loudest of all, back in the autumn when the walls were still rising. He'd stood at the edge of our clearing with his arms crossed, telling anyone who'd listened that we were building our own grave, that the mountain would swallow us whole come the first real snow. I remember his voice carrying across the frost, sure of itself the way only a man who's never been wrong yet can sound. He had the finest cabin in the valley, mind you, good lumber, proper joints, a stone chimney a mason would have been proud of. He had no reason to think he'd ever need us. But the storms don't care what a man's cabin looks like when the wind finds every seam in it. It was past midnight, on the coldest night we'd yet seen, when we heard the pounding at our arched door. Desperate, uneven, like someone striking it with a fist that had gone half numb. My husband lifted the bar, and there he stood, that same skeptical settler, snow crusted thick on his coat, his lantern long since gone dark, his face the color of ash. His chimney had cracked from the cold. His fire had gone out hours before, and by the time he'd noticed how bad the cold had crept into his bones, the trail back to anyone else's place was already buried past finding. He didn't say a word about roofs collapsing that night. He just stood in our doorway, shaking, and my husband pulled him in by the arm before the wind could argue. I sat him by the hearth and wrapped his hands around a bowl of broth before he could even manage his own name properly. He kept looking around at the stone walls, the packed earth ceiling, the warmth that didn't seem to be going anywhere, like a man trying to solve a riddle through a fog of exhaustion. "I was wrong," he said finally, quiet, staring into the fire like it might argue back. "Lord help me, I was wrong about this house." My husband only handed him more bread and said nothing of it, because there was nothing that needed saying. Some lessons a mountain teaches on its own, without a man's help. By morning, the settler was strong enough to sit at our table and eat like he hadn't in days, and when he finally looked up at us, there was a different look in his eyes than the one he'd worn all autumn, something humbled, something grateful, something that hadn't been there before the snow taught him what our stone walls already knew. The snow held its grip for another 6 weeks after that, but something in the mountain air had shifted, the way it does when winter knows its own ending is coming, even if it won't admit it outright. I remember the first morning the icicles along our stable eaves began to weep instead of hang, frozen and silent. A slow dripping that sounded almost like music after so many months of only wind. My husband stood outside listening to it with his hat in his hands, and I knew without asking that he was thinking the same thing I was. That we had made it, that the house had made it, that whatever we'd built into that hillside had done exactly what we'd hoped and more. By the time the road opened enough for wagons to pass again, word of our winter had already traveled faster than any wagon could. Settlers who'd once stood at a distance shaking their heads now came walking right up to our arched door, hats in hand, asking questions they'd never have thought to ask in autumn. How thick were the walls, truly? How had we shaped the beams to curve so? Whether the earth on top needed tending come summer, and how deep the storage rooms ran, and whether a man might dig his own root cellar the same way if his hillside allowed it. My husband answered every one of them patiently, walking them around the outside of the house, showing them the stone, letting them press a hand against the packed earth roof, and feel for themselves how solid it stood. I watched him from the doorway some afternoons, and there was no pride in his face, none of the satisfaction a man might allow himself after being proven right, only a kind of quiet relief, as if he'd simply been waiting all along for the mountain to say what he already believed. The families who'd lost fences that winter began rebuilding differently, setting their new cabins closer to hillsides where they could, angling their walls the way ours were angled, learning what it meant to let the earth carry some of winter's weight instead of fighting it alone. It wasn't long before two of the homesteads down toward the valley had root cellars dug deep enough to shame their own drafty cabins, and one young couple, not much older than we'd been that first autumn, asked if they might come stay a week and simply watch how we'd done it, room by room, stone by stone. I baked bread for them the way I'd baked it for every stranger who'd come through our door that winter, and my husband walked them through the timber work with the same patience he'd shown a frightened, half-frozen neighbor in the dark of the storm. We had come to that mountain with nothing but desperation and a hollow in the rock. By spring, it seemed, we had become something the whole settlement leaned on, and neither of us had ever meant to become that at all. The fire had burned low while I talked, and I hadn't noticed how far the shadows had crept across the stone floor, the same floor my husband laid one bucket of mortar at a time when his hands were young and unscarred. My grandchild sat quiet a long moment, the way children do when a story has settled into them deeper than they expected, and then asked, so softly I almost missed it over the crackle of the coals, whether the house was truly the same one. "Come see for yourself," I said, and rose slower than I once did, my joints reminding me of every winter since that first one. We walked together to the arched door, the very door my husband had built with his own two hands from timber he'd shaped by lamplight, cursing softly at the stubborn grain, laughing when it finally curved the way he wanted. It had darkened with age, the wood gone the deep brown of a well-used saddle, but it swung open on the same iron hinges, smooth as ever, and the cold mountain air rushed in carrying the smell of new snow. "It still holds," my grandchild whispered, running a hand along the frame, and I told them yes. It had held through my children's childhoods, through my husband's slow, contented aging beside me, through more winters than I could rightly count anymore. It had sheltered his laughter and my flour-dusted hands, our daughter's first steps on this very stone, and now it sheltered a third generation standing in the doorway with wide eyes, watching snow begin to drift down over the ridge, just as it had that long-ago autumn when we'd first stood here with nothing but a hollow in the rock and a stubborn kind of hope. I told them the roof never once gave way, not in 60 seasons of snow, and that somewhere out past the tree line, root cellars and hillside cabins still stood as quiet proof of what two frightened, determined young people had figured out by lantern light and cold hands. The neighbors who mocked us were long gone now, most of them, but their grandchildren still spoke of the winter the mountain nearly won. And didn't. "Grandmother," my grandchild said, pulling their coat tighter against the wind, sneaking through the open door, "will this house still be standing when I'm as old as you?" I looked at the stone, worn smooth by generations of hands, and at the timber beams that had never once complained under all that weight of snow and years. "It was built to outlast us all," I said, and pulled the door closed against the coming storm, sealing us both into the warmth my husband and I had carved from the mountain itself, a warmth that had never once gone out.